I'm the interim assistant director for the Oakland Public Works, and on behalf of Mayor Libby Schaaf and City Administrator Sabrina Landreth, I'd like to welcome you to the City of Oakland. You're all here today, hopefully, for the AltCar Expo. We've been doing it here every year for about the past 5 years, and each year our goal is not necessarily to grow as an audience, because you can see we're somewhat limited by the venue, but grow with topics and grow with participation. So it's really cool to see familiar faces out there in the audience, but it's actually almost more interesting and rewarding to see some new faces. So I want to thank you all and welcome you here to the City of Oakland. Before we get started, I need to thank our sponsors, our generous sponsors, without whom we probably wouldn't be having such a successful program this year, and that's Honda, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, and Cyber Switching. So if we can get a round of applause for our sponsors. So this morning we're going to have a couple of changes. You might have noticed that I have a new fashion accessory, and before you rush right out to get one, you should probably understand there's a lot of pain and discomfort involved. I actually had shoulder surgery last week. Some of you have heard this, and I'm not really feeling that well, but I thought it was important to show up this morning to at least get the event started and make sure that we had someone from the City of Oakland here to welcome you. So that there's going to be some small changes. We've asked Suzanne Lucen from San Francisco Clean Cities to fill in as the MC, and David Worthington, this fleet manager from the County of Sonoma, is going to moderate my panel, and I'm going to go home and lay down for a little bit. So with that, I also wanted to acknowledge our East Bay Clean Cities board members that are in the room. David Worthington, can you raise your hand, please, sir? And Rick Ruvolo, he's hiding here somewhere. There he is. Appreciate your guys' support. Without you guys, this also wouldn't be taking place. And also Suzanne from the San Francisco Clean Cities organization. So I mentioned previously the AltCar Expo is an annual event, and we try to do new things. Well, this year we've got Dr. Dan Sperling. He's going to deliver the keynote speech, and those of you that aren't familiar with Dr. Sperling, he's the director of Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis, and he's also a person that I consider a friend and a colleague. I've worked with him for several years, and those were some of the most interesting years in my professional career, working on the campus with UC Davis with such forward-thinking folks, and being able to not just talk about some of the clean air vehicle activities and efficient transportation activities, but actually put them into play. So it's really somewhat of a homecoming to see Dan here today, and we're really thrilled to have him. We're talking about a gentleman that's nationally and internationally known, and he's got a new book out. He's going to tell you a little bit about it if I stop telling you how great he is and introduce him. So I'm going to do that right now. Dr. Dan Sperling is Distinguished Blue Planet Prize Professor of Civil Engineering and Environmental Science and Policy, and founding director of the Institute of Transportation Studies at the University of California, Davis. He was appointed to the transportation seat on the California Air Resources Board by Governors Schwarzenegger and Brown, and served as chair of the Transportation Research Board of the National Academies in 2015 and 16. Among his many prizes are the 2013 Blue Planet Prize from the Asahi Glass Foundation Prize for being a pioneer in opening up new fields of study to create more efficient, low-carbon, and environmentally beneficial transportation systems. Dan served twice as lead author for the IPCC, sharing the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize, has testified 7 times to the United States Congress, and provided 40 keynote presentations in the past 5 years. He has authored or co-authored over 250 technical papers and 13 books, including 3 revolutions, steering automated, shared, and electric vehicles to a better future, which all of you should have a copy here today. He is widely cited in leading newspapers and has been interviewed many times on NPR radio, including Science Friday, Talk of the Nation, and Fresh Air, and most importantly, in 2009, was featured on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. So if that's not enough, like I mentioned, he's a friend and a colleague. I'd like to introduce Dr. Daniel Sperling.
Thank you, Richard, for that very generous introduction. I really am delighted to be here. And this book just came out a few weeks ago. And so I'm really just starting what some people said, are you on a book tour? I said, no, I'm on a book campaign. And that's one of the main reasons I'm here, other than it's hard to say no to Richard more than once. But this is a campaign because, and you're the target audience, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about is local government, fleets, and it's change at the local level. And so I'll get to all these points I want to make with you, but I'm really delighted to be here to be able to talk to you about it. So, up, down, all around. There we go. So to set the stage here a little bit, maybe this is a little stronger wording than many of you would use, but in many ways our transportation system really is extraordinarily expensive, resource intensive, unsustainable the way it is now. And it's become a transportation system that is focused almost entirely around our cars. We've created very much of a car-centric lifestyles, car-centric cities, and we've done this. We've pioneered this in California. I like to say, well, it was really Southern California, but it was California, and it spread to the rest of the world. It is spreading to the rest of the world. And I'd just like to show this little slide because it kind of highlights how far we've gone and in the wrong, too far in that direction. Cars are certainly, they've been amazing, played an amazingly important and positive role in our economy and our society. The mobility it provides is unparalleled. But if that person would get out of that SUV and walk the dog, there would be less energy used, less greenhouse gases, less pollution, and they'd be healthier. So, okay, so we've created this transportation monoculture, and just a few numbers here. What we've seen is, over time, that carpooling has been shrinking, and this is so if you go back, carpooling accounted for about 20% of our commutes in the mid to late 70s. And then we got serious about trying to increase carpooling. We built carpool lanes, in LA, that little diagram there, photo is LA, and it looks like that spaghetti set of freeways because they built all of these flyover lanes from the HOV lanes. You can't cross 5 lanes of traffic, so they built those, billions and billions of dollars. So we did all of that, and what happened? Carpooling is now down less than 10%. So we did all that, and it's gone in the wrong direction. I mean, you have to call that a failure of the transportation profession and our leaders. And at the same time, mass transit, which plays a hugely important role in our cities, really, at the end of the day, only accounts for about 1 to 1.5% of the passenger miles traveled. So you're all PMT, VMT kind of people, right? Well, familiar with that. So the PMT carried by transit is just a little over 1%. People use other numbers. 5% of commute trips in the metropolitan areas are transit, but then you start working down in terms of total travel. It's very small. So cars have become dominant, have essentially won the war. And it's extraordinarily expensive. So these are just some numbers to highlight how expensive and resource intensive it is, how much we spend on roads, how much we spend as individuals for our cars, for owning and operating our cars, for oil, climate change, air pollution. And so here we are, 2018, and most of us have been working in the transportation profession. I've been working in it for decades, and I know many of you have also. And really, in some ways, it's really been boring. There's been very little innovation, very little change. One of the least innovative sectors in our society. I mean, really, if you look back to it, what was the last big innovation? Maybe you might say interstate highways, limited access expressways. Well, that was 50, 60, 70 years ago. Our cars are functionally the same. Transit is functionally the same capacity, same speed. Still use petroleum fuels for the most case, except for buses that use natural gas in California. So anyway, now all of a sudden, so I tell my grad students, you are so fortunate because now, after all these decades of so little change, now the world of transportation is about to change. We are on the cusp of dramatic changes that will be transformational eventually. So the question is, how do we create this more sustainable transportation, these transformations? And I said my LA epiphany. I'll just to be brief, I don't want to tell too many stories here, but I was just sitting on a freeway about 8 months ago in LA, and just running a few errands on the weekends. I probably traveled about 40 or 50 miles total. It took me about 8 hours of time in a car that weekend, to do that 40 or 50 miles. And this is, we in the transportation profession have been trying to improve the transportation sector, reduce congestion, improve access, and here's where we've ended up. So that's how we get to the three revolutions. So electrification, that I think many of you are familiar with. I wasn't going to talk about it in my presentation here, but we're going to have Q&A, and I'll be very happy. Actually, much of my life is consumed by electric vehicles in my role at the California Air Resources Board, as well as research programs. And I should note my colleague from CARB, John Joya, is here joining us as well. I know he's a local government guy as well. That's why I like talking to him. So we got the pooling of rides, shared rides, Lyft, Uber, Via, microtransit, and then automation, which hasn't happened yet, or we've had partial automation in our vehicles, but we haven't got to the point where the cars will drive themselves, but we're getting close. And so what I really want to focus on is this pooling idea, because I think that is what the key to this more sustainable transportation system is, certainly in terms of reducing congestion and leading us to a much more better future, especially as we get towards automation. And electrification also, but as I said, I've talked about that so much for so many years. I'm going to move on to pooling here. So we have now, this is a graph that shows what happens if we automate our cars. And this is a study that was done. We actually gave people chauffeurs to simulate the experience of automated cars for their own cars. And what we found, if you have an automated car, you're going to dramatically increase your VMT. For the very simple reason that right now, when you're in a car, you don't really want to be there for the most part, right? It's to get somewhere. But if that, and we as transportation professionals, we always use the value of time in determining whether we should build a new freeway or a new ramp or whatever, and we value time at $10 to $20 an hour on average. People in this room probably would value it much higher than that. So you have all of that time in the car now you can use for other things. So you don't really care so much. You're not going to use that $10 or $20 or $30 an hour to value your time, because now you can sleep, you can eat, you can watch a movie, you can text, you can do anything you want. And so being in the car is not going to be a cost, or it's going to be a small cost. So our experience is people will end up driving a lot more. Just think, I notice a few gray hairs in the audience like me. And what we found is older people really had the biggest increase in VMT because many of us, as we get older, we don't see as well. The dark, we don't like driving in the dark as much. And so now freed up. And so it's not just elderly, though. It's young. It's the mobility disadvantaged. So the result is going to be if automated vehicles are personally owned, individually owned, there will be a dramatic increase in VMT. And we're already seeing with Lyft and Uber. So actually, I gave a talk at Uber last night at their headquarters. So I'm fresh from thinking about Uber a lot. And all of the studies that are being done are starting to come up with the same finding that Uber X type services with a single passenger, they do lead to an increase in VMT. Not a big one, but a small one. And the answer for that is pretty clear. It's because, first of all, they're only carrying one person. There's a lot of empty deadheading going on when they're driving. And so you get that small increase relative to what it would have been otherwise. And then you have these are all the different effects. So they do reduce some driving because some people will use it in place of driving, of having their own car. And so this is an analysis that was done. But the net effect is a small increase. So the answer is, therefore, we've got to increase the load factors, the utilization of all of our vehicles, cars, buses, the microtransit services. And now we have the tools to do it. I was talking with Richard, 15 years ago, we were talking about how do we get people to carpool, to use vans, to use these jitney services. And it was real awkward because the information, the transaction cost, the information was not available. Now we've got, these smartphones have changed everything for the opportunities in transportation. So the result of this is when we automate our vehicles, if they're individually owned, they're going to lead to a large increase in VMT, if they're individually owned. So the question is, going forward, this pooling or sharing, how does this really work? So there's the graph on the right there of what's happened with carpooling. And it's the red line at the bottom. It's gone from 20%, to less than 10% over the last 30, 40 years. And so people aren't naturally, even though we train our kids to share, somehow it doesn't stick. When we get to sharing a car, carpooling, Americans are not inclined to share vehicles unless they have to. We certainly do it in airplanes, but that's because the alternative is so bad. So the question is, would people embrace pooling? And what we're talking about here is basically Uber Pool, Lyft Line, Via. So how many of you are at least occasional users of Uber and Lyft? Yeah, see, I think almost everyone here. And the Uber Pool, and how many have used Uber Pool or Lyft Line? Okay, so probably 2/3, 3/4 of you. So that's what we're aiming for, and making it a lot better. So actually, I'm going to go through this more analytically, but I'm going to say to you, your mission, in your jobs, what you need to be doing is not only supporting the pooling services, but figuring out how to champion them, because this is the future. This is the future of transportation, and the pooling services, the Lyft Line, Uber Pool, are the first step in that direction. And we need to build that up and build the inventory of people that are using it, build the market share, and eventually, because we're going to get to automation. And when we get to automation, if those cars are individually owned, it's going to be a disaster for the transportation system. It'll be great for the individuals, and I'm going to talk about, why, we've talked a little bit about that already, but that pooling is necessary for our cities, for our society, for our economy, frankly. And so that's your job. And we can talk a little bit about what that actually means. But I think if there's one message from this talk that I hope you bring back with you is, how can you support more pooling in all kinds of different ways? And that means, okay, with Uber, maybe some of you have to hold your nose a little bit. They've done a lot of things that a lot of us are not comfortable with. They had a CEO that, wasn't the most touchy-feely nice guy in the world, created a corporate culture that wasn't always the best. But the services they've created is so important for transportation going forward, and along with Liftline. So the question is, would people would people pool? And by pooling, would eventually give up car ownership, because they have access to most of the travel they need, and then we'll supplement that with car sharing, where you need an occasional car once in a while. But would people do it? So there's a lot of reasons they would not share. And what we talked about, you save so much time in your car, why should you even bother sharing? Just pay a little extra. And you get those benefits, and there's concerns about security. There's no adult in the, if you're sharing a vehicle with others, if something goes wrong, there's no one there in the car. People many people live in their cars. They have all their tennis equipment, golf clubs. They carry their dogs. There's all kinds of reasons people are going to be reluctant to share. So that is the process, though, the future that we're headed to. That, if we want a more sustainable transportation system. So, but we can do it. And it's going to require a lot of policy, because we have to incentivize the sharing and disincentivize not only single occupant vehicles, but zero occupant vehicles, because that's what we're going to end up with, a lot of zero occupant vehicle use. These cars will be sitting in this meeting. You think I got to leave about 11 o'clock. I don't want to pay for parking. I'll just have my car drive around on the roads, for an hour or two until I'm ready to leave, right? Or I'll send it back home and then come back here. So there's going to be a lot of that zero emission usage. All right, so I want to get to Q&A. So this is just a funny little slide one of my co-authors of the book did from Florida, and kind of making the argument that, are Americans really going to give up car ownership? Second Amendment, adding in cars to bearing arms. So, the key to this is the cost of this shared ride. So we call it, in the jargon that's used, is mobility as a service. And mobility as a service means companies like Lyft and Uber, but it's Ford Motor Company, GM, it could be transit operators themselves, are going to run these mobility services. And the cost of these services is going to be so cheap if the cars are pooled and automated. First of all, the cars are going to be run 100,000 miles a year. It means you spread out all those costs over 100,000 miles per year, as opposed to 10 or 15,000 for us with our cars that we drive now. And then you're not going to have a driver. So the cost is going to be very low. It's going to be half to a third of the cost of owning and operating our own cars right now. And so it'll get down, if you have like two people in a car, you're talking about a 15 cents per mile cost. So just think about that. Go out to Oakland Airport from here, what's that, 10 miles or so? That would be $1.50. Those are the kinds of numbers we're talking about. So that's what we need to do, is somehow make sure that number and that reality dominates in the decisions. But we're going to need policy, because many people, even with that, are going to be reluctant to give up car ownership. So the question is, which cost factor is going to dominate? The one of saving time in the car, or the cheaper transportation service? And these revolutions are going to be very disruptive. Uber and Lyft have already disrupted taxis. They've had some effect on transit, although other factors are affecting the drop in ridership in transit a lot more than Lyft and Uber, but it is playing a role. But even the auto industry is going to be disrupted. The oil industry is going to be disrupted. Never mind rental cars, insurance, parking. So kind of to pull all this together is looking at this positively, optimistically, where do we need to go if we want to create a more sustainable transportation system? And so what we have to do is create more choice. And that's part of this pooling option is people do not like to have new taxes or new charges imposed on them. We saw with the 12-cent gas tax in California, there's already a proposition to get it, to remove it. And it was 12 cents. You all know, that's so little in terms of what people are paying, and it's so important to just filling the potholes, never mind all the other things. So, but people don't like taxes and pricing, and they have good reason in this case because we depend on our cars. We don't have any choice. There are no alternatives for most of us and most of the time. So if we impose a gas tax, it's seen as a punishment. And in many ways, that is what it is. So the path forward is creating more choice. We got to improve the transit system, but that's really a small part of the total. And we have much greater options for much more market share using these different kinds of pooling services. We can get this up to, as we get it automated especially, we can talk about the market share of these services being 40, 60, 80%. There's no reason why that can't happen. But we're going to need pricing to make that happen. So, when I talk to politicians, I say, well, incentives and disincentives. They don't like the P word or the T word. And so that's where we are, is creating those incentives, creating the choice, and preparing for the next step when the automation comes along, because the automation will be here. We can debate how soon, but it's certainly coming in the not so far off future. So thank you. It's a pleasure here, and I hope you bring home some of these messages and put them to work. Thanks. So I think we have some time for questions, and I'm happy to do electric vehicles also. Yes?
Thanks for concise, informative remarks here. On your point of pricing, how do you see the role of congestion pricing? You kind of focused a little more on the technology change, the habits of users, but what do you see as the role of congestion pricing in the urban area?
Well, is this working? Yeah. So there's so many ways of doing pricing. So if I talk to my economist friends in the university, they just say congestion pricing is the answer and it solves all problems and we go forward. The political world is a lot more difficult than that. So I think we got to figure it out, locally and different, maybe in state level, some cases. So yes, ideally congestion pricing is right, but I think we start with the high occupancy toll lanes, and that's a good way to start it. Maybe now the state is considering replacing the gas tax with a VMT fee, and there's pilot tests going on, and that's another path forward for it. And so I think we got to get a little creative, because what is technically or academically the best way to do it, or scientifically, is not politically the easiest way to do it. But yes, the answer is yes. Yes.
I was wondering what role you see. Thanks. I was wondering what role you see municipalities playing in shaping the kind of arena that shared autonomous EVs are going to be in, and then on the other side of that, what ways can they screw this up by getting in the way?
Well, probably the only way they can screw it up is by doing nothing. And so really the cities and counties play a huge role in this, and that's kind of why one of my motivations to talk to a group like this, because at the end of the day, it's going to be a lot of those incentives and disincentives are going to be local. They deal with curb space access. It deals with partnerships between transit and these different kinds of services. It means creating these incentives like hot lanes, pricing, parking. So much of this is at the local level, and so that's where and that's where the impacts are going to be also. So I think we need to get, and if you talk to so I started talking more and more to the various mayors and city council members. They don't even know what I'm talking. I mean, they have vague conception of what we're talking about. All they think is Uber, Lyft, up traffic in my downtown, congesting the streets, and my airports, and that's as far as their cognitive, sense goes. So there is a real education process involved here, is getting local government people to think about what are the opportunities going forward, as opposed to being stuck on the here and now with Uber X type services. Yes.
Do you have recommendations for incentives to increase pooling? And also, have you seen ones out there that you think are interesting or not interesting?
I've seen bad examples. So a good example, Chicago just recently adopted a much larger surcharge on what we call TNCs, on Uber and Lyft. And the way they did it is they made it per ride. In fact, that's what almost everyone does. There's no incentive for pooling. In fact, it's kind of like a disincentive for pooling. And at airports, so I'm not sure what Oakland Airport does, but I'm pretty sure they just have a single charge per ride. What they should be doing is figuring out a way to do that where if a vehicle is picking up multiple riders, the surcharge is less or even zero. And for individual riders, it's bigger. So that's kind of a simple here and now example. I should say that at UC Davis, we've created an entire program, the Three Revolutions Policy Initiative. And the mission of that is to help refine these ideas, or what are some model ordinances or model policies, to disseminate the research better, to give briefings and work with a lot of others. And we're going to be doing a lot more of that. So if you are interested, then follow up with me, and we'll be doing more and more. And if you have, especially as part of an organization that might want to play a role in this, then that would be especially good, because we can't go meet with every city council member. But yes.
Is it the idea for Uber and Lyft to have parking lots similar to bus parking, where they would live when they're not doing routes? Because currently people are coming from 50, 100 miles away to drive in the city centers.
Right. So you're talking about when we get to automated, then the cars can park themselves anywhere. So you would want to put them in places not 50 miles away, and you don't need to. They're 50 miles away. They're driving because they're coming to get the surge pricing and density of rides in San Francisco, especially in the evenings. So, but here we'll be able to manage the whole system, do it in a very rational way, and so we'll have much more ability to create the whole system in a way that will reduce VMT. So the goal here, to put in really simple terms, other than pooling and pricing is the one message. The other message is we want to increase passenger miles traveled, PMT, and reduce VMT. Because this is a great opportunity to improve accessibility by mobility disadvantaged, whether physical problems, low income, young, old. All of a sudden, all these people have access to a relatively low cost, easy to use service. And this is really, from an environmental justice, social equity perspective, this is really a tremendous opportunity. Who owns the vehicles? Yes, that's the big question. Who is going to emerge? So all the car companies are creating subdivisions or affiliate companies, to do that. Obviously, Lyft and Uber are candidates, microtransit companies like Via. So, I mean, it could be, if our transit operators were more capable, had more resources, then they could do it. You know, LA Metro maybe could in LA. They're big. And in Europe, I think some of the transit operators will. You know, in the U.S., most of the transit operators have been starved for so long and atrophied for so long, they just don't have the capabilities to take on something like this, at least in the near term. Yes. Oh, back.
Sorry
Yeah.
for the confusion. I have the mic here. So first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. A lot of the innovations we've talked about require an infrastructure component, even if that's something as simple as congestion pricing, needing cameras or license plates, scanners, or something more complex like ITS. In addition, and piggybacking off of the question of who owns the vehicles, where do you see the sort of the scope split of work for who pays for the cameras and the internet modules and the various sort of added accoutrement that you're going to need on roadways? Is that companies? Is that municipalities? Where are they going to get the money? I'm curious about your thoughts. Thank you.
Well, that's a great question. You know, we have a situation where innovation, like associated with the automotive companies and the Silicon Valley companies, is racing ahead. And, it is that Silicon Valley mentality and culture. And we have infrastructure that inches ahead in terms of change for a variety of reasons. Some of them good reasons, some of them not as good. And so part of the challenge is how is this system going to actually work? So actually, I had a meeting with the guy at Uber a few months ago that was running their program. By the way, those that follow the news is the guy that was fired and so on. But he's a brilliant engineer. But he explained it in Silicon Valley thinking, and that's what means that they're going to build their car, they're going to make it work, and they're going to have the cameras and the sensors and the LiDAR on the vehicle that'll detect other vehicles and detect curb, and they're going to map everything within the car. And they said, ideally, we'd have the infrastructure sending us signals, the traffic light sending it. Well, for now, we're just going to have our cameras look at the traffic light and see whether it's green or red and use that. So it's a really good question. And this question, how the public sector actually does this in a timely way, because, they're going to make decisions. I mean, the fear is they'll make decisions on infrastructure, on technology that'll be passed by before they even build it. So I don't have the answer to that, but it's an acute concern. Public-private partnership has to be part of it. So some of these companies have to be participating in it.
Hi, good morning.
Okay.
So related to this and with autonomous cars, on city and residential streets, it's challenging and dangerous and sadly deadly now. And I've been skeptical about AVs on streets, and I've been wondering, and about your thoughts too, if it's possible to just have AVs on freeways where there's no human interaction, there's no traffic lights that you have to read, there's no trying to read people, and only have AVs on the interstates, and then humans take control on the city streets. If there's any discussion about that or what you think about that.
Well, there's some discussion about that, but I don't think that's where it's going. So the AVs on freeways already exist. The Tesla and the Cadillac and a few others already are essentially capable of going. I wouldn't trust it. In fact, I've driven in Tesla, and if the lane has been restriped, it gets confused. But I have my next door neighbor, 25-year-old kid. He said he was in his Tesla he fell asleep on I-5 for 15 minutes, and he's living to tell about it. But anyway, I think the question, I think the real point is AV technology is going to be dramatically safer than us. We humans are very flawed. We drink, we smoke, we text, we're distracted. there were 37,000 deaths, traffic deaths in this country last year. And something like 90% of it was due to human error, connected a lot with distracted driving and drinking. Robot cars are going to do much better than that. They're not going to be perfect, as that Uber car incident a couple days ago demonstrates, but they're going to be much safer, and they're going to be much safer on city streets and everywhere. The problem, so I don't think there's anyone that's really involved with the technology that would disagree with that, or even any, experts that analyze it. I think that it's pretty clear that the technology will be far superior to what any human can do. The challenge becomes more from a public acceptance of it, kind of as you suggested. There is a concern that they're not going to be that safe. And the problem is, if it's us, then we acknowledge and accept frailties and flaws. If it's a corporation, we don't. So we're going to hold these cars and these companies to a much higher standard than we would ourselves. And that's going to be so that's going to slow down the process. But it's inevitable. It's going to happen. It's going to be everywhere. It's hard to imagine any scenario where that doesn't happen. It's really a question of time. He's holding on to it.
A quick question. What about the network security component in this autonomous connected world that we're looking at over the future? It seems like tremendous risk from that aspect when you look at all the hacking that's going on today. I mean, essentially everything gets hacked. What happens? How do you plan for that? That seems like the biggest risk here.
Well, it's a big risk, and it's a privacy issue. It's a cyber security issue. But it's pervasive through our society now. I mean, they know where I am right now. And there's a lot of data, and there's a lot of hacking going on. We're going to have to, there's a lot of people trying to deal with that, but it's going to be one of those challenges that we'll deal with, and it won't be perfect. And that's just part of this story going forward is, again, if we hold, I guess I would summarize it, but let's not let the perfect get in the way of the good, but yet let's be cautious, and let's do this in a reasoned kind of way, but not go to one extreme or the other. Thank you.